I
Well,
was
good
muted.
morning, good afternoon, folks. Thank you greatly for joining us today. I'm BK. I'm the director of the Park Maintenance Institute. And today we're going to be hitting a topic that has been frequently requested from folks working in the parks industry um, and land management as well. It's talking a little bit about pruning. And today we're going to have a high level overview of a crash course, if you will. As Vinny has told me, normally this is a full day event with hands-on aspects as well as classroom information. But since we still are in this Zoom world, we're going to kind of condense that down and just have a refresher for some folks and a great overview for other folks that want to learn new information. So trees are long-lived woody plants that provide so much to our communities and park settings. Proper tree maintenance and pruning in our landscapes can improve safety, reduce storm damage, prevent the spread and decay, and extend the life of trees. Without an understanding of tree biology and proper pruning, trees are often severely damaged, leading to unsafe, decaying trees. So for this shop talk, we've invited an expert from Penn State University Extension to introduce us to the fundamentals of tree pruning. We will learn pruning theory, terminology, pruning cuts, and plant biological response. This session will focus on pruning objectives, timing, applying cuts, improving structure and safety, common pruning mistakes, important tools and techniques for working safely. So our learning objectives for today are to gain an understanding of woody plant response to pruning, wound closure, sprouting, compartmentalization, and decay. We're going to learn three types of pruning cuts, how they are applied, and their impact. We're also going to learn how tree structure can be improved through proper pruning. And we're going to learn about tree pruning tools and safe use. So to begin this session, I'd like to introduce Vinny Catrone, who works for Penn State University as a regional urban forester and natural resources extension educator for Northeastern Pennsylvania. He's been doing that since 1991. Prior to that, Vinny was an urban forester and street tree planting coordinator with New York City Parks Department. He was planning and supervising contracted tree plantings in the late 1980s. He has his BS in forestry from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and he worked on his master's at Michigan State University. Vinny has been an ISA certified arborist since 1993 and has developed educational programs presenting throughout Pennsylvania and the country on various topics ranging from tree species selection, planting and proper tree pruning practices, and establishing shade tree commissions, inventorying trees, developing shade tree ordinances, and green stormwater management. So now I'm going to put the mic down and I'm going to hand it over to Vinny.
All right. Thank you, BK. So I think my sound is on and I'm good. My slides are up. So yes, as BK mentioned, we like to teach pruning with a little bit of hands-on activity. And, you know, pre-COVID, we were running workshops. We'd spend about a half a day indoors, slides, terminology, you know, going through deciduous evergreen shrubs and so forth. And then go outside and actually apply what we've learned in smaller groups, pruning material that might be on, say, a campus. So we'll get back to that someday. And if you're interested in more stuff like that and you're in Pennsylvania or wherever you are, look for a land grant, extension. The Land Grant University has an extension outreach arm. We do lots of trainings and workshops. And again, you know, here we are on Zoom, and I hear there's someone on from Hawaii. So hopefully some of this applies to you in Hawaii. I think it will. They're woody plants. So let's get started here. Let's see. Oop. All right. So for us, at least in Pennsylvania, the end of next week, you know, tomorrow is Earth Day, and Earth Day is great, and we celebrate Earth Day and I typically have about 1,000 kids in a park, students, when we're not in the middle of a pandemic and we have all these educational stations. But next week, the last Friday in April, for those of us in the Northeast, is Arbor Day. And Arbor Day is a great time to go get some trees planted in parks, get some youth involved, get some volunteers. We do lots of this. Last week, we were actually planting quite a few trees. But again, it's one of our oldest holidays, and we should try to at least celebrate some of this in parks. So there's my commercial for Arbor Day. Hopefully you're going to do something. Let's get started on pruning. And I really wanted to touch on some of the resources that are available. Lots of good stuff available online for free. I can tell you that printed material is getting scarcer and scarcer. I think it's about budgets, right? So, the Forest Service produced How to Prune Trees, great little pocket guide. I don't think it exists in printed format anymore. Pruning Landscape Trees is a Penn State publication. I think we're in the process of revising that, but that is available. And if you want to go the next step, look at Ed Gilman's. Ed Gilman is a retired professor, University of Florida, started his career in Rutgers. It's the 3rd edition illustrated guide to pruning. Very good book. So if you're really into pruning, take a look at those resources. And the International Society of Arboriculture produces these pretty easy reads, these little guides. They call them the BMPs, or best management practices. There's ones on planting and pruning and lightning protection and all kinds of stuff related to trees. Fertilization's one of them. So this one is pruning. I believe it's in the 2nd or 3rd edition at this point. Very good, easy read, and actually affordable. We're going to talk a bit about structure, and we're going to talk about young trees. So there are some other resources available. Chris Luley, the ABC Guide to Pruning Young Trees. Larry Costello from University of California had an article on 5 steps to training young trees. And by the way, I'm going to give you my email address. If there's anything you're looking for, email me and I can send you those resources by email. Or you can go out and search for them, again, at the ISA's website, or the website on the bottom there. That's too long to write down, is the University of Florida's. That's Ed Gilman's website. There are actually slide sets that you could download. There are video clips. So a great resource. I think if you just Google Ed Gilman, University of Florida, you'll probably find it much easier than trying to capture that URL there. Okay, so if you were in a classroom with me, I'd be asking you all for a definition of pruning. Since you are in cyberspace and you're listening to me, I can't do that. But so I'll give you my definition of pruning. It's the art and science of removing plant parts. And when we talk about plant parts, it's not just branches. Most of us think about branches because large trees in parks and along streets, that's what we're dealing with. But if you were in a nursery setting, you're pruning roots to get a more fibrous root ball. You might be pruning flower buds if you're trying to create mums that are nice and compact and bushy. And there should be a specific purpose that we are pruning, not because we bought a new chainsaw, not because we think it's spring and we have to do this, okay? We should have a reason. And we're going to talk about some of those objectives or reasons in just a bit. When we talk about the science behind it, we have to understand these are living biological, woody plants. And there's a response to us removing either too much leafy tissue, which provides food for the plant, or think about it, we are wounding it. Every time we prune something, we are wounding live living tissue. So there is a biological response to us wounding it. The art piece of it is understanding the plant's natural form and shape. I mean, we could take any plant, I guess, and turn it into a box or a ball. And I see that with shrubs all the time. But what we really want to understand, how should this plant look? So I'll give you an example. In the Northeast, and they just flowered, Forsythia. Forsythia are a large cascading plant, can get 15 by 15 feet, and they sort of droop. They need lots of room. They're not really designed, or, if you understand that form, you got to give that plant lots of room to do its thing. And in most home landscapes, there's no room for Forsythia, and people just prune them into these boxes or balls, right? So understanding the plant's form really is important, okay? So why do we prune? This sort of the objectives behind us, that specific purpose piece of my definition. Plant health is so important. If we're going to keep those long-lived woody plants in our landscapes for years to come, and they're going to outlive us, pruning dead wood, removing, that's source of decay, source of inoculum for spreading disease is really important, right? The next most important thing really is improving structure and form, and we're going to talk about that. And some of us call it training young trees, right? Training young plants. The other piece of it is reducing risk of failure, safety, right? In a park setting or along a street, I always think about trees in the forest. If they start to fail in a storm, it's not a problem. They're going to fall down. They're going to turn into habitat. But in a park, along a street, we've got liability concerns. We've got property damage. We just have to try to reduce the risk of failure by either removing trees or pruning properly. Providing clearance and controlling plant size. Sad to say, controlling plant size seems to be the #1 reason that people prune plants in and around their homes. They think the tree's too big, the shrub's too big. Providing clearance is a little different, right? So we may need to get cars underneath it. We may need to get the mower underneath it. So providing clearance is important. We might also need clearance from above because power lines are going to run past that tree, okay? We can influence flowering, fruiting, and vigor, especially true if we're talking about shrubs. Multi-stemmed, fast-growing shrubs. I'm thinking lilac, for example. They just stop flowering when those canes get too old, those stems. So you really need to reduce and remove some of the older canes to reinvigorate the plant and get better flowering. If we're talking about pruning for fruit, then we are thinning to get larger fruit instead of lots of small fruit, right? And we want sunlight, and we want branches that are going to hold that fruit up. So the whole different way to prune, and we're not going to talk about that, but it is one of the objectives to pruning. We can improve a view, and hopefully that doesn't mean we're cutting the top out of the tree, right? It's called vista pruning. We can reduce shade and wind resistance, and there's a lot of work in this area now. We used to thin and tend to over thin trees in order to either get more grass to grow, or we thought that the wind would move through it better. There's a lot of research changing our thoughts about thinnings. And then improving aesthetics, right? And I always tell even property owners, if someone has come and pruned your tree and you come home, it should still look the same. It shouldn't look drastically different, right? But we can improve aesthetics, and it's really not about sort of shaping the tree. The tree has a natural shape and form, right? So we're going to focus on structural pruning because we really don't have a whole day to get into all of the pieces of pruning. So we want to look at things like if it's going to be a large shade tree, whether it's in a park, around a home, or along a street, we want to maintain a central leader. And I'll explain why as we go on with this. We want to remove or reduce what we call a codominant branch. A lot of the trees that we have taken out of the forest and we grow them out in the open, we get multiple leaders and these things called codominant stems. And we really need to, if we can remove one, great. If it's too big to remove, we want to shorten, and we'll show you how to subordinate and reduce a codominant branch, right? We want to allow spacing between branches. That's about good health and structure. We want to provide for some clearance. Maybe it's lower branch. We call it a crown raising. And we want to try to prevent any future breakage and failure, right? Open grown trees need training. This is just, it's not a forest. We need to prune and maintain those trees, right? If we leave codominant stems go, and this is an elm on Penn State's campus, right? And you can just see how with time, these two stems have, between wind and weight and even just the pressure of them growing larger in diameter, these codominant stems are starting to fail and split. They haven't failed yet. Now this one has failed, right? And again, this one failed, not a big deal, park or a backyard setting, but certainly we've lost half the tree because we didn't do structural pruning when the tree was young. This one failed and hit the house and doing damage in the backyard. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's where the codominant stem and this thing called included bark existed between these two pieces of this maple tree, right? So it is a structural defect that we're trying to prevent, right? And what I want you to understand when we're pruning is not about shaping. It's not about shortening. Okay, this is about improving form. If we're trying to make balls and little lollipops out of trees, then maybe you should be working for Disney, and you could do that there as topiaries. But in most of our landscapes, it just doesn't work, and it defeats the purpose. And we're fighting both genetics and we're hurting the plant because we're taking off too much live leafy tissue. So, here's all these heading cuts from this shaping. This was a London plane, a big sycamore tree, right? And they promote a lot of decay. They promote a lot of water sprouting. We'll show you more of that. And heading is one of the 3 cuts we're going to talk about today. So before we get into those 3 cuts and how to apply them, you've got to understand that it's a large, living, green plant. Photosynthesis is how it gets its food, right? So green leafy tissue is the only way it makes food, even though someone will tell you, oh, we're going to buy some plant food and we're going to spread it around the base of the tree and fertilize it. It's not plant food. Plant food is sugars, carbohydrates made by those leaves, powered by sunlight, right? And if we take too much of that leafy tissue away, the biological response to the plant is, I'm going to grow. I have to grow. I have to make more leaves. So I'm going to find energy somewhere to devote into vegetative growth in order to keep myself alive, right? And replace those green leafy photocells that are now gone. So one of the biological responses is put out more vegetative growth. Pretty interesting. I mean, we think that, oh, we're reducing the plant in size, but the plant's response, if we take too much, is produce lots of water sprouts. So, and we'll show you where some of that's coming from. The other thing we've got to understand biologically is there's communications going on within the plants. It's done through hormones, and the terminal buds, the buds at the tips of branches and at the tip of the central leader, are communicating with all the buds further on down the stem, and they are inhibiting that auxin that's produced, that growth hormone, is slowing down the growth of the buds and branches lower in the tree. And that's because think about it, these trees have competed for sunlight in a forested setting with lots of other trees, lots of other stems, and whoever gets to the top of the canopy in the forest wins. The others get shaded, they die, they fall into the forest, and they turn into soil, right? So it's really important to understand that when we remove that terminal bud, the buds further down that twig say, okay, something happened. It's my turn to grow. The auxin's no longer there. So you get sprout growth. So what I want you to really understand is when we cut all the terminal buds off, we're removing this auxin, and we're interrupting that communications. It's kind of like a deer going through the forest and biting the bud. And where's your next sprout going to come from? It's going to come from lower in the tree. Or a storm coming through, top breaks out of the tree, the new growth is going to come from below, right? Now, that auxin also goes all the way to the root system and initiates root growth in the spring. So here's the interesting thing. If we get young trees and we're planting them, and I used to work with some old Italian landscapers many years ago, and they said we had to cut back every branch a third to compensate for root loss when we move this plant in the nursery. And really what we've learned from research is that's counterproductive. We're going to stop root growth from being initiated by that auxin that's produced that goes all the way to the root system, right? So just remember that. It doesn't mean we can't cut terminal buds, but remember the response is we take the auxin away, we're going to get sprout growth, right? And how much auxin and growth hormone is produced in the plant really sets these plants up for these 2 distinct forms, X current and D current. So X current, we think about species like spruce and pine and oak, especially pin oak, right? Black gum, sweet gum, tulip poplar, very strong central leader. They have a lot of what we call apical dominance, right? A lot of hormonal control throughout the plant. Codominant or decurrent have more codominant leaders. So think about sugar maple, ash, zelkova, elm, hackberry. They tend to be decurrent, and that hormonal control is at the branch level, not as strong throughout the tree. So we've got to understand the plant's form also as we prune it, and understanding that some of those plants that are decurrent are going to get some codominant stems, and we may need to do a little bit more pruning and deal with that. Okay. The other thing biologically we have to understand is that branches are connected to the parent, either the trunk or the parent branch, by something called a branch collar. Now, branch collars, I have to preface this with, branch collars are not on codominant stems, and we'll explain why later. Okay. So a smaller branch that's attached to another branch or the trunk has this interweaving of branch wood and trunk wood at the base of it. That's what holds that branch in place so it can sway in a 30-mile-an-hour wind without breaking off. It's also, each branch is sort of compartmentalized and segmented. If the branch gets shaded and can't produce enough food for it, the rest of the tree is not going to send it food. It dies. When it dies, it breaks off from, decay and loading, and you get a wound closure from the thing called a branch collar, right? So you can see here on this dead stub. So we've got to understand how the plant is put together before we start taking it apart with a saw. That's why I'm talking about branch collar. So you can see each and every year, a new layer of wood is put on both by the tree and the branch. The branch puts that layer on. It ends at the base of the branch, and then it becomes enveloped and wrapped around by trunk wood. Year after year of this accumulating wood, this interweaving of wood, creates a very strong attachment, right? And it creates this thing we call branch collar. So just, again, keep that in mind. You've seen it. If you've split wood, if you've pruned trees, you've seen branch collar. Internally, what's happening is again, the tree is sort of compartmentalized. So the branch can die, start to rot away, and that's tends to what happens. I mean, there's fungal spores everywhere. So decay is going to set into dead wood and start to move into this dead branch. By keeping that branch collar intact, and a healthy tree just walls off that decay and tries to close the wound. What we want to do through pruning is help it, right? So when we make our cut, we just want to cut dead wood off if there's a dead branch there. We don't want to cut into branch collar because now we're cutting into the trunk, and we're going to allow decay to spread into the trunk where it really shouldn't be, right? Think about it. Trees prune themselves in the forest. They shed branches wherever those branches have been shed, and we have a branch collar close that wound. We now have a knot. Think about it. When we work with wood and we run into a knot with our saw, that's where there was a branch that became encapsulated in healthy trunk wood. Okay, so let's keep going. Timing of pruning. Timing of pruning. Some people get, worried about this sort of thing, and pruning during the dormant season, when they're out of leaf, is good from a health standpoint. It's not the only time to prune, but from a, there's no fungal spores moving about, there's no insects. We can, hopefully see the dead wood. We can see branch structure, certainly, because there's no leaves in the way. So period 5, which is the highest part of stored energy, is a great time to prune. But again, not the only time. We can prune dead wood anytime. Anything that's spring flowering, if we prune it in the dead of winter, well, we're going to knock off some of the spring flower buds that, we would like to see open. So maybe we prune those after they're done flowering. I mean, I prune my rhododendron after they flower, prune my dogwood or the magnolias. I mean, magnolias are spectacular. So we want to prune those after they're flowering. Now, there's 2 periods to avoid, and that is just as the leaves are coming out. We have a dwarfing effect on the plant. We can also rip and tear bark because there's a lot of moisture moving. And then period 4, which is just before leaf drop, right? We want the plant to not resprout. As I said, when we prune, the plant's response sometimes is, I'm going to grow. So we don't want it to resprout. We want it to harden off, get ready for winter, go dormant. So again, 2 periods to avoid. As the leaves are coming on the tree, bud break, which is happening right now, and as the leaves are just coming off the tree, okay? Otherwise, can we prune in the middle of summer? Certainly. I wouldn't suggest doing it during a hot, dry, droughty summer, but you can prune in the middle of summer also, okay? And again, deadwood anytime. That's about risk. It's also about health. If you can get the deadwood off the plant, the wounds are going to close, okay? So let's talk about different types of pruning cuts. So the first is a heading cut, and a heading cut is really described two ways. It's back to a bud on a 1-year-old shoot. So a very fine twig, and I do this on roses. I do this on a lot of shrubs. You could do this on young trees. Prune back to a bud. You can redirect growth by which bud you select. It's also described as cutting back to a point between branches, leaving a stub. That's on an older branch. So the schematic here that shows the cut leaving this stub, that is a heading cut. It's rarely appropriate on established trees, and we'll show you why. It's certainly something we do on shrubs, especially fast-growing shrubs. And a lot of the heading cuts that I make on fast-growing shrubs are about 6 inches from the base of the plant, because I'm trying to get new shoots, new canes, and rejuvenate that plant, okay? We'll explain why it's a problem if we do this on big branches, on big trees, right? So here you go. So here are some heading cuts. So this poor maple tree was headed back several times. So where there was a branch that was strongly attached with a branch collar, someone came in and just indiscriminately shortened the tree and made lots of heading cuts. Right below those heading cuts, we got sprout growth. And that's what all of this is. And sometimes those sprouts are 6 or 8 feet long the very first year, because the plant's response is, I'm going to put stored energy into making a new canopy. I need leaves to survive. Someone came in here and pruned it again, made nothing but heading cuts on all those water sprouts. The problem with it is you get lots of decay. Wherever those heading cuts are made, that stub just rots away, and decay moves very readily down the vascular tissue, the water conducting tissue in the tree. So you can see here with this tree, the merchant headed it back, and those water sprouts are at least 8 feet long the first year. What we've seen from some research is in about 3 years of a tree being topped or headed back, it gets, if it's got enough energy, it gets back to equilibrium. So we're not really controlling size with heading cuts. The sprout growth comes back because the plant needs that leafy tissue to survive. Okay, so let's talk about the next cut. Now this is the better cut to make, right? And we talked about branch collar. It's cutting a smaller branch back to its point of attachment at the base where there is a branch collar. Now, if we don't, some species visibly show us where branch collar is, and it's very easy, right? And I used to train people, have them put a blindfold on and feel the base of the branch, right? Or at least look for it. Even, if you want to train your crews, give them a Sharpie, have them mark where the cut should be made before you give them a saw, because I can tell you, once you cut it off, you can't glue it back on. And what you don't want to do is cut into the trunk. It defeats the purpose, right? We're going to spread decay into the trunk, okay? So here's a good, and it's really not a thinning cut anymore. That's an old term. It's a removal cut. It's a branch removal cut, okay? So here are some good removal cuts. Now here's a schematic that's showing you the wrinkle raised area at the base of the branch. And instead of making our cut C to D as close to the trunk as possible, which we call a flush cut, we're going to make a cut right outside of that branch collar. So it would be A to B. Now on the oak, you could just see where that branch collar exists. And again, the more you work with trees, the more you make these cuts, you're going to see branch collar, right? Here's where branch collars were left intact, and you're getting wound closure. So you get this donut of wound wood. Actually, they call it callus the first year. After that, it turns into wound wood, has strong lignin. It's very strong wood and has a really good way of sort of sealing that wound. What we want to do is promote wound closure. Trees don't heal, they just close, and they seal off and try to seal out any decay and internalize any decay to that branch wood, right? Now, if we make a flush cut right? Because I said, don't cut the branch collar off, right? And by the way, the reason more branch collars have been cut off is the light chainsaw, right? It's so easy to take a chainsaw and cut so close real fast. So, prior to that, 50, 60 years ago, if anybody was pruning with a handsaw, there was no way they were cutting branch collars off. It's extra work, right? So here you can see a fresh flush cut on this linden tree. And here, these are wounds that are closing on a Norway maple from old flush cuts. And if I had to take that picture again, what I would have done was brought a yardstick and stuck it in to show you how much decay, and you could see the wound weeping. Even though these wounds are old and this wound wood is closing and it'll completely close, there's going to be a pocket of decay internalized in this Norway maple, which may lead to some storm damage down the road, right? So don't make flush cuts, leave branch collar intact. That's the next question I always get is, shall we paint the wound? And I can tell you there are homeowners that are still buying this stuff and still want arborists to paint wounds. And what I typically tell people is, if it's a deck, if it's your house, if it's your boat, it's wood, paint it. If it's a living tree, leave the branch collar intact. You don't need paint. Okay. And by the way, oil-based paints inhibit wound closure and will slow it down. So you don't want, if any of you do this for a living and someone says, hey, you got to paint that wound or I'm not going to pay you, use a water-based latex paint. At least it's not going to hurt the tree. It's not going to help, but it's not going to hurt the tree. So oil-based paints will slow down and inhibit wound closure. So you don't want to use that, right? So it's a waste. It doesn't work. Okay, here's the third cut. And the third cut replaces a heading cut. It's the way to shorten a branch without leaving a stub. So what you're doing is you're shortening that branch to a point where there is a lateral branch that is smaller. Now that lateral branch needs to be healthy, right? Needs to be a third to a half the diameter of the branch you're removing. So just not to sort of mess with math, but if this is a 3-inch branch, the thing labeled A, B should be a healthy 1-inch branch at a minimum, right? A little bit bigger is better, because what you're trying to do is have enough energy in that lateral branch to close a wound where there is no branch collar and to reduce water sprouting. So hopefully there's enough auxin produced in those buds at the terminal that are going to reduce some of the water sprouting. So here's some reduction cuts, right? So the first one here, just a schematic, right? You're sort of following this thing called branch bark ridge. You create an imaginary angle or imaginary line out and bisect that, right? Now let me go back one. What you don't want to do is make a steep cut that follows branch bark ridge. If you do, you're going to get so much dieback and decay back in here. You're not going to get good wound closure. So the one in the middle was a cherry, done, worked fine, wound closed, no sprouting. The last image, the last image is a heading cut. Why? Because this 6-inch wound is never going to get enough energy from this little twig to close. So that is a heading cut. It's not a reduction cut, right? This is about energy and about auxin. This wound here, or this cut, there's going to be lots of decay spreading down, and there's going to be lots of water sprouting from beneath it. If it's got enough stored energy, there'll be water sprouting. So not a reduction cut, that last one, right? So here's a reduction cut, right? We're shortening the branch back to another lateral. By the way, the orchard industry, right? Any fruit production, they call them bench cuts, but it's the same thing. It's a reduction cut to get branches out, shorten them without leaving a stub and getting water sprouts, because you'll never produce fruit on water sprouts, and to collect sunlight. Here was a crab apple, right? We shortened it back to a lateral branch, reduction cut, right? So the two types of cuts I want you to really rely on is a reduction cut to shorten branches and a removal cut. And now we're about to apply them to some trees and show you how to improve structure, all right? So removal cut, back to branch collar, smaller branch, back to branch collar. Reduction cut, larger branch, cut back to a smaller branch, approximately a third to 1/2 the diameter, okay? Those are the cuts you really want to make. Try to avoid heading cuts, okay? So without reading all of this, this is about spacing of branches, maintaining a central leader, shortening any of the codominants, right? We're looking at vertical spacing, selecting what we call scaffolding branches. That's going to be the permanent structure for the tree. Okay, so let's keep going. When we go to enter that tree and do some pruning, and it doesn't matter whether we're doing young tree pruning or older trees, this is the order of branch removal that, you know, a good arborist and you guys, it should hit your head, right? Dead, dying, disease, decayed, and damage come first. Why? That's about safety and health, right? It's about safety for anybody around the tree, and it's about the health of the plant. So that's what you want to target first. Next, we start looking at rubbing and crossing branches because they wound one another. A branch that grows back into the canopy and rubs against another one is going to create a problem. Then we look for tight V branch unions with included bark. Those are those codominant stems that just break apart, right? And again, we'll show you some research why that happens. Next is water sprouts. And I say some water sprouts because if you've got nothing but water sprouts coming out of this plant, it is either under stress or it was mispruned. And if you take all the water sprouts off, you're going to get nothing but water sprouts the next year, right? Last on the list is the stuff that's sprouting from the root system at the base of the tree. And we see crab apples do this, lindens, you know, basswood will do this. That's less of a problem. So that's why it's last on the list, okay? Dead, dying, disease, decay, damaged branches first. Then we look at structure. So if we're going to start pruning, and I like to say, we don't do enough of this, by the way, with young trees. We want to start working on structure of trees that were planted 2 to 3 years ago, right? You want them to get established. You want them to grow a root system before you start pruning the top, right? And they need leafy food to grow root system. Then we want to look at, you know, every 3 to 5 years coming back and working on structure, not shaping it. We're talking about structure, right? Oh, codominant stem, let's remove that. Oh, let's remove some lower branches. We've got better clearance for the mowers now, right? So this training pruning, you know, at least 3 times in the first 15 years in the ground. And again, we don't do it. We tend to plant trees, walk away from them until a branch crashes out of it. And then we hire someone to figure out why that happened and what we should prune now, right? So it's best, and it's real easy, and it's affordable to work on young trees, right? Dormant season really is the best because we see visible branch structure. So we'll show you some of this. So it really should start in the nursery. I'm not here to beat up the nursery industry. Some do a really good job of this, and some are busy producing trees, right? And they don't work on structure as much as they should. But that's the place that it should start. We shouldn't have plant material coming out of the nursery looking like this, codominant stems, or this on this linden, really this tight V branch union, codominant stems. Even this one starting to form a codominant stem. Now we can probably fix that one on the maple, but these should have never been purchased and should have never really come out of the nursery looking like that. So when we're working on young trees, and I said earlier, there was an article, Larry Costello from University of California, put it as simple as 5 steps, right? So first we remove the dead and broken branches. That's because that's always first, dead, dying, diseased. Next, we look for the competing leader and remove one of those. If we can, we may just have to shorten one. Next, we're looking for where is the lowest permanent branch. And that depends on the site. So if I'm growing a street tree, on the street side, it's got to be 14 feet. It may not even be on my young tree yet. So when I come back in the future, I'm going to start looking for that lowest permanent branch. On the sidewalk side, I'm probably looking for something at 7 feet. So I have pedestrian clearance, right? Then we start selecting the permanent structure and reducing or removing any of the competing. The other thing we need to understand is some of these branches we're just going to shorten through reduction cuts and leave them on temporarily because we don't want to take too much live leafy tissue in any one pruning. Why? Because we disrupt the plant's ability to build trunk taper and to survive and produce a root system, right? So sometimes we just shorten things, we leave them on as temporaries, okay? The other thing I needed to sort of stress here is that there are some things that some diseases and insects that if we know what we're looking for in the landscape, we can prune them out and solve the problem. So the thing in the middle is a bagworm, right? And I can tell you there, you'll see them on Arbor, and people miss them because they're hidden in amongst the evergreen, but we're seeing them on all kinds of trees. I mean, I'm seeing them on lindens and honey locusts and sycamores or London planes. And that is a caterpillar that has laid a couple of hundred eggs in this bag in the spring. Those eggs will hatch, the caterpillars will come out, and they'll cause feeding damage. So if you have your pruners and you know what you're looking for, one snip, and by the way, you can't pull them off. You'll break a branch if you're trying to pull them off. They're so spun on there, right? But if you prune that, imagine that you just took a couple of hundred eggs away with one pruning cut. Now take it off site and get rid of it, throw it out, burn it, put it in some alcohol. But managing some diseases and insects can really be done if we know what we're looking for and we have pruners with us, right? In the middle lower is the source of dogwood anthracnose, which is a canker on fine dead twigs. I prune my dogwood every winter because it's going to be the spring splashing of these fungal spores that lead to anthracnose on leaves and flowers the very next year, right? In the upper left is fire blight, right? And we see that a lot on rose family. So a lot of the apples, crab apples, and so forth. We're seeing it on pears. That's a bacterium. The only way to control that is prune it out, prune into soundwood, do it in the dead of winter because you don't want to spread that bacterial ooze to the next plant. You also want to clean your tools when you're done pruning something that had fire blight. The oak with the big knots on it, the galls, that's caused by a wasp. And if you find a few of those, prune them out. This poor oak tree needed one pruning cut at the base at this point. It just had too many oak galls on it. And then you've got cedar apple rust, which is a disease, an alternate host disease that moves from junipers and spreads to things like serviceberry and apple, right, or hawthorn. So some of this is understanding what plants shouldn't go together, but some of it is also pruning, right? So let me keep going here because I know I'm going to run out of time. Recreating a leader. A lot of times your central leader in transplant either gets overtaken or dies. In this case, we had one that was damaged. We actually just structurally put a stake in here, tied it, and put this black gum, one of the laterals, back into a leader, right? Here we had a tree. It was a street tree. There was a house fire and the top of the tree died. And what you're looking at on the left-hand side is a very vigorous sprout that took off. The center of the tree had died. So what we did was we came in and made a reduction cut, right? We couldn't leave it looking like that. That's what the cut looked like. Then you can see to the right, the wound's closing. That's the tree a few years later. So we recreated a tree from a sprout, basically recreating that leader, right? Here in this oak, you can see we have a competing leader starting to form. And what we're going to do is just make a reduction cut in here and shorten it. So we're trying to maintain, and the tree doesn't look much different. And we really, with a pole pruner, one cut, we solved the problem here while the tree was young in the landscape. When we're talking about that lowest permanent branch, and I kind of alluded to it, street tree 14 feet, street side, or I should say sidewalk side 7 feet, it's about pruning. If we don't do the pruning, I can tell you, even in a park setting, people at the park will do the pruning. They will break branches off. In this case, a street tree, the Pepsi truck's doing the pruning for us because we haven't gotten to this tree to do a crown raising. Okay, so it's best if we start when the plant's young and the pruning wounds are so small that they're going to close within a year or two. If we wait too long, as we've done here with this tree, I mean, now we've disrupted taper. We've got, I don't know, 4, probably 5-inch diameter wounds. Just not what we want to do. And this was all done for clearance for a sign, by the way, right? This, we're starting young, we're pruning them up. What you don't want to do is try to get a young tree to 14 foot overnight. It's just, it's not going to work. This is just as overkill, right? We've disrupted taper. That's why I said earlier, you want to leave some temporary branches lower on the tree and maybe just shorten them to slow their growth, right? So here's a crown raising. This shop owner wanted the tree cut down. And we said, well, we're not going to cut the tree down. We understand you want your sign visible. And you could see the before and after. And, you know, earlier I'd said it's about how much live crown you take. I think we took less than 10% live crown. Didn't hurt this linden tree in any way. We've improved its form. We've improved clearance for both a delivery truck and this shop owner's sign, right? Same thing here at this church. We had a linden, not a linden tree, a Crimson King maple. You can barely see the gentleman underneath it. Probably took about 5 to 10% live crown. We probably could have gone a little bit further, but we stop. Again, it's pruning in moderation. So we've done crown raising. Here, these shop owners, you know, more and more I see shop owners. I get it. They're small downtowns competing with big box stores and online, and visibility of their sign tends to be important, right? So they blame the trees. They want to cut them all down, but trees make that downtown livable, make it walkable. And something as simple as, you know, getting a crew out and pruning lower limbs to get sign clearance. The merchants just love this. It's what's needed. You know, even in a park setting, a little bit of crown raising is important. And sometimes those lower branches are just going to get shaded and begin to die anyway. So work the crown up, but again, with moderation in mind. When we talk about scaffolding branches, we talk about vertical spacing. So if it is a tree that is going to be a small maturing tree, a dogwood, a crabapple, a hawthorn, spacing between the branches can be 6 to 12 inches, right? We don't want them next to one another. 6 inches, 12 inches, not bad. If we're talking about a large maturing oak, maple, we want 18 to 36 inches of vertical spacing between what we're going to leave as the permanent structure, the scaffolding branches, right? So, you know, we want to get rid of those competing leaders. I want to get to some real pictures here, so I'm going to skip some of the schematics here. So here's good form on an oak, right? Nice vertical spacing, central leader. Here's an oak with poor form. Same species, just came out of the nursery, had codominant stems, now has included bark. You could see the fissure, right? So there's no grafting going on here because there's bark compressed between them. As these get larger in diameter, this is the tree's point of failure. I can't tell you when, can't tell you which storm, but this is where the tree will fail. Now, someone will always ask, so what do you do now? Well, you could put a cable in them, right? And try to hold them together. It should have been prevented through some structural pruning many years ago, right? So that's what we're looking for when we look at codominant stems. Now, some species, I think of honey locust, think of some elms, hackberry, are going to push the bark up and out. They just tend to have this V branch structure. If the bark is turned in, that's more of a problem. It's just a weaker structure, okay? So how do these codominants form? It's really, again, about energy, right? So that lateral branch, when it begins to get greater than half the diameter of the trunk, it becomes a codominant. We start to lose branch collar. There's not enough energy on the trunk to really suppress that and close and create a branch collar, right? So here's a maple street tree. There's 3 codominant stems, right? Because it was planted and sort of let go. Now, some research that's been done looked at how much force it takes to break branches that are, you know, this is what we call branch aspect ratio, okay? So the branch that's 50%, right? So that's half the diameter of the trunk, tends to have a strong attachment, tends to have a good branch collar. The one at 75 is nearing codominance, but it's not a codominant stem yet. It has some branch collar. It takes less force to break, but it's not as strong as the one that's half the diameter, but still not terrible. The one at 90%, I mean, this is almost a 1-to-1 ratio. There's no branch collar here on either one of them. And with time and with storm, they will break, okay? So again, that research sort of applied to different millimeter branches. And you can see at 50%, that's the one with the good branch collar. Even the larger branch, the 14 millimeter, it takes more force to break that branch out because it's been there longer, it's got a stronger branch collar. When you get to the 1-to-1, the codominants, the 90%, it doesn't take as much force to break those branches. That's why we see storm damage. When we see storm damage, it's codominant stems. Now, I hope you're not planting any Bradford pears or Callery pears. They are very invasive. Sad to say, they're still, sold very cheaply in containers everywhere in all the box stores. But they come out of the nursery looking like that. There is no central leader. Give them 20 years, they look like that. And that's not because they're weak wooded. That's because of codominant stems. Okay, they just break apart. So here's a codominant stem on a maple in a park setting. And I want to stress to you, so what we're going to do is break some rules here. Earlier, I said, don't take more than 25% live crown at any one time pruning, right? My slides said that. We're going to take 50% live crown. Now, we had 3 choices here with this tree, with this codominant. We could come in here and we could spend a lot of time making reduction cuts and taking a lot of energy off of one side. Then come back in a few years and make the final cut there. The second option was cut the tree to the ground because it's going to split. And the third option is what we did, which was, okay, we're going to take the codominant stem out now and see what happens. So there you go. With one cut, we took 50% of the live crown of the tree. We made a cut where there is no branch collar. So let's come back in a few years and you could see, because there was no branch collar, you got dieback to the ground on that side. You're going to have a branch, or the codominant stem is now dead. So we could have a pocket of decay there that's maybe 4 inches in diameter, not a big deal. Wounds closing nice, the tree looks good. Come back in a few more years, the wound's really closing nicely and the tree needs more pruning because it's an open grown maple. We lost the central leader again. It's just taken off the codominants, right? So I share this because sometimes, it's better to take the chance and do something than to leave the tree and have it fall apart, right? And I can tell you that wrapping something around the stems or threaded bolts, we call this bracing, through a young tree, this is just not going to hold for long. You could just see the cracking, you could see the problem. This really needs one pruning cut at the base and start again. It should have been pruned out when it was young. So I want you all to think about defects and correct the defects before they get worse, right? So let's talk about how we maintain a central leader through this process called subordination. Now, subordination means we're not going to cut the codominant stem out completely. We're going to make a reduction cut, take some of it away, slow its growth down, and let the central leader go. Okay. And you can see in the middle is sort of a light pruning, and then you have a moderate pruning. And I liken those to, okay, I've got a good budget and I know I'm going to come back to this tree in 3 to 5 years. I'm going to go with the light pruning because it still looks good, right? The other one tells me I'm not going to get back to this tree for 5 to 8 years. I better go ahead and make that cut and take a little bit more. As long as the plant's healthy, sometimes taking a little bit more isn't going to hurt it. Okay. So here again, the schematic, the before and after, let me show you some real pictures, right? So here was a pear, wintertime. Those branches are subordinated by using reduction cuts, right? Same thing here. This was downtown Pottsville. So these pears were put in. You could just see they're a bit of a mess. Well, we've got it back to a central leader by making a few reduction cuts, right? We couldn't take the codominants out completely. Same thing here. This was a homeowner's tree. You could see the point of failure is the codominant and included bark there. Had we taken that out, we would have taken probably 30% of the tree's canopy, and the homeowner would have been really, really upset. So we made some reduction cuts, maintaining a central leader. We're still not done. A few years later, we have to come and take that one out, okay? So you can just see some of those reduction cuts. Sugar maple, take sugar maple out of the woods, planted in a park, in a yard, we get lots of codominant stems. And here you go. There's codominant stems on this. You could just see where's the central leader. I've got to create one. In the dead of winter with no leaves in my way, I could do that. And I could do that because I know how to make reduction cuts and I know how to make branch removal cuts. So there's a few branch removal cuts down in here, and there is a reduction cut there, and we've now got it to a central leader. Okay, shorten that, keep that on. By the way, the sap flow in the winter is not a big deal. We call them bleeders, but it's not blood. I mean, I don't put maple blood on my pancakes, right? It's just syrup, it's sap. So it will stop after a while, but there are species, maple, beech, birch, and elm, that we call the bleeders. Sap will flow when we prune them out of leaf. If that disturbs you and you don't want, then prune them when they're in leaf. From a structural standpoint, I don't want leaves in my way when I'm trying to improve the plant's form. So here's another maple, again, dead of winter. That's the finished product. We're back to a central leader. We've got some vertical spacing. The cuts are weeping, but they're good cuts. And we step back, take a look at that. Not bad, working on form. Here was a red maple in the ground 6 years. Not bad. I mean, in most cases, in a lot of parks, we see this, and this is just let go. But I've got 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 codominant stems. After pruning for maybe 10 minutes with a pole pruner, I've got 1 central leader on this 6-year-old red maple. So I've improved form. So I'm going to take you through that tree step by step just to show you. So there's my first cut. Okay, I'm cutting back to a lateral, smaller branch. I'm using my pole clips. There's my reduction cut. Here's my second one. That's the codominant. I'm going to come in and I'm going to put my pole pruner, my clips, or use a saw, whatever works. And I'm going to make another reduction cut there. Okay, so again, I'm subordinating codominant stems, not by removing them completely, just by making reduction cuts and shortening them. Okay, again, red maple, 6 years in the ground, needs some work. There you go. All right, there's a park full of them. They were planted and kind of let go, and we had a little workshop, and it was nice to be able to take some pictures and show how we improved form. Here we took the whole codominant out, right? So you could see the arrow on the before and the after. And we just, that's one that just sort of lent itself to that. So every tree is going to be different, but that's what you're looking for, right? So again, before and after, doesn't look much different, but what we took out was this codominant stem back to there. Not a lot of time, not a lot of work, but it takes some thinking, takes the tree being visible, and takes some tools, right? Crabapple. Hard to see in this image, but the interior is thinned out. There were no heading cuts made, reduction and removal cuts made, okay? And what I want to share with you, when you're pruning young trees and you're using hand tools, a ladder's okay. And I would suggest a tripod, much more sturdier, right? It's a tripod ladder. They use them for picking in orchards. I know Alan Salmon State College has been using a tripod ladder to train young trees on his street trees for years. That's works. Now, if you're talking about power tools, chainsaw, no. Don't work off of a ladder with power tools, okay? If the trees get bigger, then they need to be climbed and someone needs to be roped in safely. So let's talk a little bit about tools and safety, and we'll wrap things up here. If you're out looking for tools, you really want to get a good, so I'll give you an example. I've bought the Felco lookalikes. They were cheapy tools that they were a third the price, and we used them with volunteers, but I can tell you none of them survived. They're broken. Now I have a pair of Felcos that were probably $50 that I've had for 25 plus years, and I've replaced the blades and I clean it and I sharpen it. So if it's your tools and you're going to take care of them, buy some quality tools. And I don't care what brand, but you do want bypass. So you want not the anvil. Whoops, sorry, move forward. The anvil cuts means a blade comes down on a piece of metal and they continually dull. This has 2 blades. It's like a scissor, right? The nice thing is you can also sharpen it. There are some tools that allow you to sharpen and clean these, so that bypass pruners are going to give you a much better cut, right? And if the branch is too big for bypass pruners, maybe a lopper. Although I got to tell you, a lopper above your head, they make you think you can cut something big, and you're just going to need a lot of energy to close those. They work great on shrubs. Getting into a shrub, removing canes, I use loppers all the time. But if something is above my head and I can't get it with hand pruners, I'm probably going to move on to pole clips, which the person is using here, or a pruning saw, right? So we'll just show you, and again, no endorsements here. There's just, I've got some images. The pruning saws are getting great because they are, they cut on the pull and the push now. They're tri-edged, and they really work well with less energy. Pole clips, I tend to, I'll be honest with you, I get them stuck. They also, not that they dull, but you can't get as close to a branch collar with something like that. So understanding the further you are away from your cut, the harder it is to make a really good cut. But pole clips have a place, right? I would certainly suggest either wood or fiberglass. You don't want anything with a metal pole, just utility, safety, right? The other thing you don't want is one that has the saw on one side and the clip on the other, because I'll tell you, one's going to be in the way while you're trying to use the other. So they make ones that have interchangeable quick change heads. Those things are terrific. I'm constantly changing heads and putting a couple of poles together to do the work. Or you can, again, buy them separate. This is not a very new gadget, probably about 10, 15 years. It takes the hand pruners and puts it on an extendable pole. The drawback is you can only cut small branches, right? So you're not going to cut anything big with it. But on young tree training, not a bad tool to have around. So these are all tools that I use on young trees. I don't have an image in here, but let me talk about it. The chainsaw on the stick, I can tell you, not a bad tool, but beware, it does not run as fast as a chainsaw because it's geared differently, right? So it's on a pole. So I've seen it get stuck numerous times in branches. The other thing, the hydraulic ones that work off of a bucket truck are very fast. The power driven ones, just, again, be safe with them. I think they have a place. The other thing I didn't mention is really, a 3-cut method. So you want to take the weight off of a branch by making an undercut first. Your second cut's just outside of that so that the branch can drop without tearing trunk wood or destroying the branch collar. And then your final cut is back just outside of branch collar, right? So that's the 3-cut method. Really the way to go on a big branch because you can't hold it and cut it. There's a safety issue there. And it may take you a few more minutes, but it makes sense to do that. Don't try to cut just back at branch collar. Watch the big branch rip and tear. Okay. I mentioned this earlier, and especially when you're pruning something that had disease on it, right? So that fire blight, that anthracnose, you want to clean your tools, right? And years ago, it used to just be dipping. And I can tell you, dipping in between cuts makes absolutely no sense, doesn't do it, right? Wiping, and we've heard this from our plant pathologists, wiping is important, right? So you could use a 70% alcohol, so 70 alcohol, 30% water. You could use a 10% Clorox, or you could use a 30% hydrogen peroxide solution. Your decision what you use. Wiping is good also because any of these chemicals are corrosive, right? I know someone who sprays Lysol on her tools and wipes them down. That's fine. You probably want to put a little bit of WD-40 and some grease in there to keep them from rusting and corroding. But that material will get rid of the bacterial ooze and the fungal spores. And again, not just dipping, wipe them when you're done, right? I hope none of you are pruning like this, but I see this. This is the, I'm going to pick on townships, but roadside rural pruning. And I got to tell you, from looking at these, and so it's a flail mower on a boom. Works great if you're destroying and cutting all the vegetation down and you're working on a bank. not designed to be sitting up like this. It's really a safety issue. Now, I'll tell you a story. We had a crew that was using them on a levee. Now, and I get it. They were using them the proper way. They were mowing brush down with them. A piece of wood from one of and again, not a big tree, but a woody stem, piece of wood flew into the leg of a nearby jogger. The jogger thought he was shot by a sniper. They called the police, and we just, we figured out it was from this, it was a piece of wood that moved from this flail mower that went into a jogger's leg. So if you're using these things around other people in this fashion, really, really dangerous. Also understand that this is going to rip and tear branches off. Forget about branch collar, respecting branch collar. This is not good for the tree. But again, I see it used because it's a mechanized way to clear branches out of roadways. I would much prefer them train a crew. And I've used JEPTA, used to be Job Training Corps, many, many years ago. Young high school and college kids, and teach them how to prune with a pole pruner and send them out and do some of this work. But again, this mechanized stuff is out there. Just beware. It's a safety issue. So talk a little bit about safety, because this is a whole other hour talk on safety. There is a document, OSHA document. It's called ANSI, American National Standards Institute, Z133. It is tree work, right? Any work with trees, it tells you what kind of hard hat you should have on, when you should be wearing chaps, if you're climbing that tree, how you should be tied into 2 places before you start work, right? So a lanyard and a rope. And again, it's important because it is the law. OSHA has made it the law. Okay, so you should probably know the document exists. You might want to get a copy of it, right? I think the Tree Care Industry Association sells it. The other hazard is always electricity. You'd be amazed where electric lines run through trees, right? And that's a whole, don't ever go near anything that has a line running through it. Even if you know it's a house drop. I can tell you stories of guys who've hit a house drop with a hand saw flash, and all the teeth on the saw were melted off, and they were lucky. Okay. The gentleman here in this image is working off of a ladder. He's falling because he was not roped into the tree, and the chainsaw is falling beneath him. So I did not take the picture. One of our safety trainers found this. Don't work off of a ladder. Don't use a chainsaw above your head. We do chainsaw safety trainings. If any of you are really interested, we've probably got some webinars recorded that we could share with anyone. Okay, so let's just go through some PPE that, and I get guys all the time who, I'm just pruning trees. I don't really need a hard, yes, wear a hard hat, right? You only get 2 eyes, wear some safety glasses. And by the way, they make some really cool safety glasses these days. If you're running a chainsaw or a chipper, ear protection, very important. You only get 2 ears. And I know I'm losing my hearing from working a chainsaw for years without, okay? Gloves, they have new ones with saw protection. They're not required, but strongly recommended, right? Here's what is required, right? Chaps. If you're running a chainsaw on the ground, you should have chaps on. And I can tell you that, what are they, 150 bucks? They're still cheaper than the stitches that you will have to pay for if you cut your leg, right? And the damage that gets done. So wear the chainsaw chaps, make sure your crews have them. They actually then keep your pants relatively clean. They work, they will stop a chain. Also, it's not required steel toe, but protect your feet, right? And you should have, if your crews are going out doing pruning, they should have first aid and CPR training. That's important, right? So they should have the knowledge. And again, that's a whole other set of training, just like this is a whole other set of training that, anything within 10 feet of a conductor. And by the way, we're not talking about high voltage power lines. We're talking about cable TV, telephone, house drops, you need what's called EHAP, electrical hazard awareness training, because you shouldn't have any of your tools or any part of the tree come within 10 feet of any of those conductors, right? That's, again, whole other topic, but safety is really important. If it's something that you cannot get to and do, you know, don't put a guy in the bucket of a backhoe with a chainsaw and start pruning. Contract it out. If you want some contract specs on how to do that, email me. And my email's right there in the middle of the slides here. I'm sorry I went a few minutes over. If you want a set of the slides, I'd be glad to share them. If you want any of those resources, shoot me an email and I will send those out to you. And that includes contract specs or whatever you're looking for. Shoot me an email. Sorry, BK, I'm over.
That's okay. It was a lot of great information, Vinny. And as you said, we could spend multiple hours on going through things with more and more minutia, especially talking on the safety aspect of things, and even on the maintenance of equipment could be an entire topic within itself. So we'll see if I can get you to come back and tackle with us again in the future.
Yeah, if you want someone on chainsaw safety and tree felling, we've got some folks in Extension that, you know, aside from me, that I think would do a really good job with this for you.
And we will, one of my plans for this fall is we are going to be ideally hosting some in-person trainings, and one of those is bringing Mike from Penn State University to do his chainsaw safety training for us. And so those are some things that will be coming up in the future. And also in June, we're going to be having your colleague Sandy Feather talking a little bit more about some planning and ideal planting kind of methodology and design for sustainability within our parks, so we can think more on what we put into the ground as opposed to just taking care of things.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So thank you everyone so much for sticking with us today. If there are any questions, please feel free, email Vinny, email me, and let us know what kind of help that you need. Lanky, thank you for sticking with us and getting up so early in the day, coming from Hawaii. And Vinny, you have been invited to go to Honolulu. So.
Oh, okay. I'll take you up on that because it's about to snow here. So.
Yeah, the weather is changing very quickly. It's not quite Mother's Day yet. That's what I've always been told.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
You don't put your tomatoes in the ground until after Mother's Day.
No, but my trees are in the ground and they'll be fine.
That's right.
So, all right. Thank you, BK.
Thank you. And everyone else, thank you so much for your participation. We look forward to hosting you again in the future. So again, I'm BK, Director of the Park Maintenance Institute, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone.